Episode 6 Saunders Aircraft moves to Gimli. In aviation circles, when the word Gimli is mentioned, the topic usually moves over to the Gimli glider story, an Air Canada Boeing 767 airliner that ran out of fuel over northern Ontario on July 23, 1983, and successfully landed dead stick at the Gimli airport. The 767 jet landed with no injuries and only slight damage when the nose landing gear collapsed. The Air Canada Gimli glider incident occurred to a fuel miscalculation issue between imperial and metric units. Insufficient fuel was put on board the 767 for the trip from Toronto to Edmonton, and the jetliner ran out of fuel. The Gimli glider story is an exceptionally good aviation story on its own. However, the Saunders Aircraft move to Gimli created its own headlines for Gimli. The joint announcement by Saunders Aircraft and the Manitoba government of Saunders Aircraft moving to Gimli was front-page news in Manitoba. The newspapers reported that the Manitoba Development Corporation, an arm of the Manitoba provincial government under Provincial Labour Industry Minister Leonard Evans, would provide a $750,000 loan for Saunders Aircraft to relocate to Gimli. Gimli is located on the west shore of Lake Winnipeg, 82 kilometers north of the city of Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is Canada's sixth largest lake. Gimli's population in 1970 would have been about 2,000 residents, and the population increases greatly in the summer when cottagers and campers spend the summer in Gimli. Gimli was established in 1875 by Icelandic immigrants that fled Iceland during the 1873 volcanic eruptions. After crossing the Atlantic Ocean by ship to Montreal, the Icelanders would get to Duluth, Minnesota by steamship on the Great Lakes. They then took the train to Moorhead, Minnesota, and then by train to Grand Forks, North Dakota. At Grand Forks, they would board a stern-wheel paddle boat for the trip to Winnipeg. At Winnipeg, the Icelandic immigrants would pick up supplies and head north on the Red River by barge and York boats to their homesteads on the west shore of Lake Winnipeg. They would set up a settlement that they would call Gimli. Gimli would stay predominantly Icelandic, with farming and fishing as the main activities in the new settlement. Life in Gimli continued an even keel until World War II, when the Department of Defense announced that an air base would be built 2 miles west of Gimli. No other event would have a greater impact on Gimli than the establishment of the air base by the Department of National Defense since the arrival of the Icelandic settlement. The construction of the Gimli Air Base was announced on May 19, 1942. The Gimli Air Base was to be the largest in Manitoba. Political controversy in the Gimli Air Base soon followed. The two Winnipeg daily newspapers, the Winnipeg Free Press and the Winnipeg Tribune, both ran stories in October 1942 that the federal government had greatly overpaid for the farmland to build the base on. The newspaper articles went on to say that Gimli farmland was valued at $30 per acre, while the federal government had paid $72.43 per acre for the land. The issue of overpayment was raised in the House of Commons. Finally, a Commons inquiry was held in May 1943. The inquiry outlined that the federal government's decision to pay the $72.43 per acre for the base land. Federal Minister of Munitions and Supply, C.D. Howe, took full responsibility for the Gimli base land purchase. Initially, the base was to have 6 double hangars, but that was changed to 1 double hangar and 4 regular hangars as the war wound down. Bird Construction was awarded a $1,113,500 contract to build the airfield, and later was awarded a second contract of $1,250,000 to build the hangars and 50 related buildings. The Gimli base was part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, BCATP. The official opening day for RCF Station Gimli was on January 20th, 1944, with Manitoba Minister of Municipal Affairs William Morton cutting the ribbon. The ribbon cutting was followed by a flypast of Avril Anson's. RCAF Station Gimli was home to number 18 SFTS, which stood for Service Flying and Training School. SFTSs were the advanced flying schools that pilots were sent to after graduating primary training at an EFTS, Elementary Flying and Training School. Number 18 SFTS Gimli used Avro Ansons as the main training aircraft and provided multi-engine training for pilots that would later fly operational World War II aircraft such as the Avro Lancaster, Handley Page Halifax, or the consolidated PBY Cancel, to name a few. With World War II winding down in 1945, the Service Flying and Training School in Gimli was transferred to Saunders, Manitoba. RCAF Station Gimli was slated to recondition European aircrews for service in the Far East Theater War. However, the surrender of the Japanese government in August 1945 halted that program. The Gimli base then housed the RCAF Winterization Experimental Headquarters for a time until that unit was relocated to Edmonton in November 1945. In 1946, RCAF Station Gimli was put on a care and maintenance basis and only used to store surplus aircraft, and would also host hundreds of air cadets each summer. The start of the Cold War and the Korean War necessitated the need for more pilots, and the Department of Defense announced on October 20th, 1950, that RCAF Station Gimli would be reactivated as a training school and designated Number 2 Flying Training School, FTS. The school would include students from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, countries. RCAF pilots began arriving in January in 1951 for the first training course. The students would use the North American Harvard AT-6 single-engine prop aircraft as their primary trainer. A need to find sufficient housing for RCAF married staff was an issue, as the Aspen Park PMQs, Permanent Married Quarters, filled up. Gimli Town Administration looked at a plan to winterize summer cottages to fill the housing demand, but a continued housing shortage remained. Subsequent flying courses would include pilot trainees from the UK, Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy, Norway, Turkey, and the Netherlands. In June 1953, Number 2 FTS would move with their Harvard aircraft to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and Gimli became the center of Number 3 Advanced Flying Training School, ATF, using the Canadair-built Lockheed T-33 Silver Star jet aircraft as the jet trainer. In August 1964, the Canadair CT-114 Tudor jet aircraft arrived at RCF Station in Gimli. This is the same jet that Canadian Armed Forces Snowbird Air Demonstration Team currently uses. Gimli now assumed a role in the basic flying training as well as the formation of Number 1 Flying Training School. In 1965, the Department of Defense spent $5 million on base upgrades, upgrading the runways, and building a new control tower. In 1967, Canadian Forces Station Gimli had a workforce of 900 military and 250 civilian personnel. The annual payroll was more than $4,200,000. The cost of maintaining the Gimli base was pegged at $292,000, and another $500,000 was spent on aviation fuel, supplies, and food. 193 families lived in Aspen Park PMQs, and 222 families were living in the town of Gimli. In February 1968, the Canadian government announced a unification of the Canadian military. The RCAF, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Canadian Army were now all called the Canadian Armed Forces, and RCAF Station Gimli was renamed to Canadian Forces Base Gimli. March 1970 had seen the graduation of 26 Italian Air Force pilots from an English language course. These pilots would leave CFB Gimli and move on to CFB Moose Jaw for more training. Thursday, August 27, 1970, started out as a beautiful summer day. Then came the news that would send a chill over this lakeside town. The Department of Defense under the government of Pierre Trudeau announced that CFB Gimli would be closing in a year's time. The news shocked the Gimli Town Council and caught the newly elected provincial NDP New Democratic Party government of Ed Schreier off guard. CFB Rivers, just north of Brandon, would also close. The Manitoba NDP government had only been in power for a year and now faced an employment dilemma in two small towns that would see a substantial loss of jobs. Ed Schreier had led the NDP party to victory in Manitoba on June 25, 1969. Schreier would create the first social democratic government for the Manitobans. Schreier defeated the incumbent and progressive conservative PC government of Walter Weir. Walter Weir took over as PC leader on November 1967 when then Premier Duff Roblin resigned to run for the federal progressive conservative leadership. Ed Schreier was born on December 21, 1925 in the Beausejour area, about 50 miles northeast of Winnipeg. His parents were of German-Austrian descent. Ed Schreier would join the predecessor to the NDP, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation, or more commonly known as the CCF Party, at 18 years old. Schreier would graduate from the University of Winnipeg and University of Manitoba with degrees in arts and education, and went to teach school in Beausejour. In 1958, at 22 years old, Schreier entered provincial politics and won election in the riding of Brokenhead that included his hometown of Beausejour. Schreier became the youngest member ever to enter the Manitoba Legislative Assembly. In 1965, Schreier entered federal politics, winning the Springfield riding and moving to Ottawa. In 1969, long-time Manitoba provincial NDP leader Russ Pauley was considering retirement. Local Winnipeg lawyer and MLA Sidney Green was in the running for provincial NDP leader. Many in the provincial NDP party considered Sidney Green too radical for a leader and started convincing Ed Schreier to run for the provincial NDP leadership contest that was to be held in June. Manitoba incumbent Conservative Premier Walter Weir, sensing confusion and weakness in the NDP, decided to call a snap provincial election. Weir dissolved the Manitoba legislature on May 25, 1969, and for the Manitoba election to be held on June 25th. Schreier won the leadership in the Manitoba NDP party on June 8, 1969, giving Schreier just 2 weeks to prepare for the provincial election.
Premier Weir is playing it cool. Cigar in hand, he tours the province, shaking hands with hundreds. He's made few speeches, avoided confrontations with the opposition, and steered clear of controversial issues. He says he's got no shopping list for the voters, just an offer of continued conservatism, stressing his balanced budget. MP Ed Schreier at the helm, the New Democrats have mounted an all-out effort, hoping to break into the rural ridings, with a leader who talks the language of the discontented farmers. Mr. Schreier says he's a social democrat rather than a socialist.
I'm a reformer, I'm a progressive, a small L liberal, a social democrat, really, which means that I believe in the active use of government as an instrument or a tool to get things done, to work toward greater equality in the human condition.
Manitoba voters, seeing Weir's snap election call as an opportunistic ploy, gave Schreier's NDP party 28 out of the 57 seats. The PCs won 22 and the Liberals 5, and the Social credited 1 seat. After the election was over, Larry Desjardins, a Liberal member, would cross the floor over to NDP party to give Schreier a workable majority. The closing of CFB Gimli came at a time when the Manitoba government was dealing with a major crisis caused by Rex E. Gross, the chairman of the Manitoba Development Corporation, previously named the Manitoba Development Fund, or MDF. The MDF was created on December 15, 1958 as a provincial crown corporation under Premier Duff Roblin. MDF's function was to be a lender of last resort. In the first 7 years of MDF existence, the fund made 206 loans totaling some $43 million without occurring a single loss. The fund operated at arm's length, a hands-off attitude from the provincial government, and was led by 10 directors. The directors were responsible and well-experienced Manitoba businessmen, one of whom was the well-respected Deputy Provincial Minister of Industry and Commerce, Rex E. Gross. Gross was born in Elkhorn, Manitoba, and was a career civil servant. Gross was the general manager of the MDF Fund. By 1966, the PC government of Duff-Roblin was determined to create industry in Manitoba's north and gave MDF the go-ahead to finance a pulp and paper mill and sawmill in the Pas, Manitoba. The complex would be called the Churchill Forest Industries, or CFI, and would be designed and built by Dr. Alexander Kasser of Austria. The CFI complex was expected to cost $75 million. MDF would put up 86% of the capital, and Kasser's company, Technical Pulp, would put up 14%. MDF and the provincial government failed to do their due diligence and failed to recognize that Kasser had created a pyramid of shell companies to finance their 14%. The shell companies would each add on a handling fee on top of each CFI invoice to MDF. The handling fees were to use to make up Kasser's 14% per share in the CFI project. In essence, MDF was funding their 80% share and Kasser's 14% per share of the capital invested. The government of Duff-Roblin relied on Rex Gross to ensure the project was professionally managed and there was no financial improprieties. Basically, it was Rex Gross between Kasser CFI and the MDF piggy bank. In 1969, Rex Gross fell under the charm of charismatic Dr. Kasser and began advancing significant CFI funds without proper documentation. When Schreyer's NDP government came to power, they felt that something was amiss with CFI. A meeting was called with Deputy Minister Rex Gross, who assured Ed Schreyer all was proper with CFI. Schreyer would appoint a former CCF member of Parliament and chartered accountant, Alistair Stewart, to investigate the CFI loan. Stewart found irregularities with MDF and the CFI and reported that to Schreyer. This background information on the Manitoba Development Corporation sets the table for MDC and Saunders Aircraft. Financial Post journalist Philip Mattis was also investigating Dr. Kasser and the Churchill Forest Industries deal. The Financial Post on March 27, 1970 would publish Mathis's article in CFI titled, "Should Manitoba's CFI project really cost $135 million?" The Financial Post article would tear open the lid on the CFI misdealings. Alistair Stewart made a special trip to New York to look at the books of Technical Pulp, one of Dr. Kasser's shell companies. However, Stewart would unexpectedly die of a heart attack on his way home at the New York airport on April 3, 1970. Later, it would be uncovered that highly respected provincial civil servant Rex Gross was advancing millions of dollars to Kasser's CFI project without proof or proper documentation, despite MDC having policies and safeguards in place to avoid the misuse of MDC loans. CFI was Gross's pride and joy, Gross's pet mega project. Gross feared that the socialist provincial NDP government would cancel the CFI project, so Gross kept sending Dr. Kasser CFI loan advances. Schreyer's people were beginning to uncover the truth on Gross's CFI loans. The true financial picture on CFI was beginning to emerge. Rex Gross, instead of admitting his wrongdoings, chose to resign as chairman of the MDC in March 1970. For the rest of 1970, Schreyer and the Manitoba NDP government would be left to deal with the CFI mess. But now the full scope of the CFI financial fraud was unknown to the Schreyer government. Now the NDP government found themselves in another crisis when the news came out that CFB Gimli and Rivers would be closing. Loss of jobs was a social issue, and the NDP, being a social democratic party, felt something had to be done to save jobs in Gimli. The Manitoba NDP's 1969 election victory was rather thin. The NDP MLA for Gimli, John Gottfried, won his seat by only 256 votes. Loss of jobs like the Air Force Base closing meant the loss of votes in the next election. In June 1970, CFB Gimli had a presence of 884 military positions and 212 civilian employees. Of the military staff, 647 were married personnel and 237 were single. 193 of the married personnel lived in the base PMQs, Aspen Park. 20 lived in trailer parks, and 150 lived in housing units at Evergreen Development. 244 families lived in Gimli, and 40 families lived in Winnipeg. The military monthly payroll was $516,000 and $85,000 monthly for civilians, amounting to a $6.5 million annual payroll, a large portion of which was spent in Gimli. This was the economic void that Ed Schreier's government was faced with. Schreier and Industry Minister Len Evans both stated to the media that Ottawa was responsible to fill the economic void left by the base closures. Winnipeg and the government of Manitoba were still stinging from the loss of the Winnipeg Air Canada overhaul base. To appease the Manitobans, the federal government had Air Canada sell the Winnipeg maintenance base to CAE. In September 1969, MDC had loaned CAE $1 million to help CAE purchase the Air Canada overhaul base in Winnipeg when the federal government allowed Air Canada to pull out the overhaul base out of Winnipeg. Len Evans knew about layoffs. Len Evans was born in 1929 in Transcona, Manitoba. Transcona was an east suburb on Winnipeg. The main economy in Transcona was a CNR, Canadian National Railway, repair shops. Employment at the CNR would ebb and flow with the economy. Evans was the only one in his family to attend university, earning a master's degree in economics from the University of Winnipeg. After a short spell as a high school teacher, Evans and family moved to Ottawa, where Evans worked for the Dominion Bureau of Statistics. In 1965, Len Evans moved back to Manitoba and accepted a position at Brandon University as an economics professor. Evans first got into politics in 1953 when he unsuccessfully ran as a CCF candidate. In 1969, Evans ran successfully as the NDP candidate in the Brighton East riding. Evans joined Ed Schreier's cabinet as Minister of Mines and Natural Resources. On December 18, 1969, Evans was Minister of Industry and Commerce, making Evans responsible for the Manitoba Development Corporation. Shortly after the base closure announcement, the provincial government invited companies to establish a presence at the Gimli base. Soon after such, an offer appeared on Schreier's doorstep. Herb Schultz, in his book A View from the Ledge, recounts the weekend afternoon that Schultz and his wife were babysitting at the Schreier house. Herb Schultz was the brother-in-law to Ed Schreier. Schultz and Lily Schreier, Ed's wife, were brother and sister. Schultz was also the executive secretary to Premier Schreier. Two well-dressed, impressive men knocked at the door. The men stated that they were looking for Ed Schreier. "Why?" asked Schultz. The businessman replied, "We heard Manitoba was looking for businesses to move to the former Gimli Air Base." "Yes, we are," replied Schultz. "What is the name of your business?" "Saunders Aircraft," the men replied. Schultz told the two Saunders men to meet with Len Evans, the Minister of Industry and Commerce. In Evans, the two Saunders men found an eager listener. The newly elected NDP government was committed to rural economic diversification. Schultz would say that Evans saw every unemployed worker as a fallen sparrow for whom Evans felt personally responsible for. Len Evans forwarded the Saunders Aircraft proposal to MDC. MDC offered Saunders Aircraft a $750,000 loan to move to Gimli. Also in the MDC Saunders agreement was a clause to cover 25% of the working capital for the next 4 years. The one ST-27 CF-XOK and the de Havilland Heron that SAC owned, plus other SAC assets, covered the MDC loan. All seemed well with Saunders Aircraft, so the joint announcement on September 25th was made that Saunders Aircraft would be establishing an aircraft industry at CFB Gimli. MDC was aware of the precarious nature of the aviation industry from their dealings with CAE a couple of years ago. The Saunders move to Gimli was big news in Gimli, though the Saunders headline would have to share the front page of the local newspaper, the Lakeshore Times, with the news that the Gimli mayor's car was demolished in a 3-car accident. Later in the month, Industry Minister Len Evans would announce that a Winnipeg company, All West Marine, a subsidiary of Western Tool and Industries, would be setting up in one of the Gimli base hangars to build houseboats. To cement the deal with the Manitoba government, Saunders Vice President Reg Kersey and production foreman Stan Zeb would fly into Gimli on October 16, 1970, on the Saunders Aircraft de Havilland Heron, aka the Red Baron, call letter CF-YAP. Stan Zeb was Saunders Aircraft Master Sheet Metal Foreman. Kersey and Zeb would meet with Colonel Rich Dunlop, the base commander for CFB Gimli. Dunlop, Kersey, and Zeb would plan out how to accommodate Saunders Aircraft at Gimli while the base was still operational, and the RCAF was in the process of packing up and moving out. However, Dave Saunders was not in favor of the company moving to Gimli. Saunders was between a rock and a hard place. Saunders needed an MDC loan to keep his company afloat. The loan came with the stipulation of moving to Gimli. Dave Saunders recalled Gimli, or as he called it, Grimli, from his RCAF training days. Grimli was the nickname the RCAF servicemen had given the CFB Gimli posting. The long, cold Manitoba winters and its inclusive Icelandic population, small town atmosphere, led to the base Gimli nickname. Saunders knew that finding skilled aviation workers in a small town would be a problem. Saunders also knew that the insulated World War II vintage hangars were not the best for aircraft manufacturing. Saunders thought he could use the MDC loan as a delaying action until financing could be found in Montreal, and Saunders could renege on the deal with MDC and stay in Montreal. Saunders Aircraft hired an aviation market consultant to do a study on the growth of commuter aircraft. The study stated that up to 400 ST-27 type aircraft could be in the need in the next 7 years to meet the market demand. However, the political climate was about to change drastically in Montreal. British diplomat James Cross had been kidnapped by the FLQ in Montreal, and Saunders Aircraft investors were worried what the FLQ separatists would do next. Moving Saunders Aircraft to Gimli looked like a safe move. Dave Saunders had lost controlling interest in Saunders Aircraft when he sold his shares to raise capital for his company and needed to keep Saunders Aircraft solvent. By September 1970, the Saunders Aircraft Board of Directors had the controlling interest, and the board was willing to move Saunders Aircraft to Gimli and hopefully recover their investment. Saunders was outvoted by the Saunders Board of Directors, and the motion to accept the Manitoba Development Corporation proposal was accepted, and the move to Gimli would happen. While the Saunders Board of Directors were finalizing the move to Gimli, the British ARB wrote to the DOT in Ottawa on September 22, 1970, explaining the conditions on which the ARB was granting Saunders Aircraft a UK ARB type certificate on the Saunders ST-27 aircraft. Finally, the ST-27 would have a type certificate, and once the ST-27 received the ARB type certificate, Dave Saunders expected the FAA type certificate would be issued reciprocally based on the aviation agreement between Canada, the UK, and the United States. Saunders Aircraft wrote to DOT on November 4, 1970, stating that Saunders Aircraft had experienced staff shortages and had let the DOT FAA certification slip, and now Saunders Aircraft wishes to pursue the validation of the certification of the ST-27 to a FAR 23 standard at an all-up weight of 12,500 pounds. Saunders asked if the FAA conditions outlined in January 27, 1970 are still applicable. Saunders, in light of program slippage and the limited liaison with DOT in the past 6 months, is asking for a meeting with DOT to brief DOT on the current Saunders Aircraft position and obtain DOT's assistance in determining the FAA program requirements and scheduling to achieve FAA certification. On the photograph below are the handwritten notes by DOT personnel on the Saunders letter of November 4th revealed that the ST-27 FAA bilateral certification is in jeopardy, especially the handwritten note RG. The SCs will only apply to aircraft eligible for export to the U.S., meaning aircraft entirely built in Canada. Modded aircraft are not eligible under bilateral or special conditions, and they not need apply. From the DOT notes, one could see that the DOT and FAA position on the ST-27 is that the ST-27 will not receive a bilateral FAA type certificate based on the ST-27 UK British ARB type certificate. DOT would write the FAA New York office on December 18, 1970, asking what the FAA special conditions for this ST-27 aircraft will be finalized. In addition, DOT would ask if Part 135, Appendix A, Item 32, and Item G for toting seating capacity of 25 still applies. The FAA New York office would reply on December 30th, 1970, to Mr. W. McLeish, Chief Aeronautical Engineer at DOT. The FAA stated that in view of the July 1st, 1970 expiration date of SFAR 23 and Saunders' inability to attain certification of the model ST-27 aircraft prior to that date, the certification basis for this aircraft will now include Appendix A to FAR 135, effective January 19, 1970. Hence, the FAA certification basis for the Saunders model ST-27 aircraft will be FAR 23, dated February 1st, 1965, with amendments 23-1, 23-6 inclusive, plus Appendix A to FAR 135. Appendix A introduced a new set of FAA requirements that the ST-27 had to meet. Appendix A dealt with aircraft performance like critical engine and operative takeout performance, the accelerate, stop distance, and other flight performance criteria. Appendix A required a fatigue strength or fail-safe strength investigation in which the structure shown by analysis tests are both to withstand the repeated load of variable magnitude expected in surface. T would notify Saunders Aircraft on January 12, 1971 of these new FAA requirements for the ST aircraft. For Saunders Aircraft, this meant there would be no rubber stamp FAA certificate approval based on the ARB type certificate. More analysis, more tests, and more flight tests would be needed to meet the FAA requirements and gain a FAA type certificate so that the ST-27 could be used by the American commuter airlines. Saunders Aircraft would have to find a new path for FAA certification for the ST-27. Saunders Vice President Reg Kersey would speak at the Gimli Chamber of Commerce dinner on December 4th. Kersey would tell the 28 chamber members in attendance their work is underway in one of the Gimli hangars, that an ST-27 conversion is underway, and that all are welcome to come down and inspect the plane. Kersey said that also 4 ST-27s have been sold and 9 are tentatively sold. Hiring for the Gimli plant began on December 1st, and that Saunders expects 100 employees in a year. Employment applications can be picked up at the hangar, and some employees from Montreal have arrived. Saunders is leasing Hangar 1 and expecting to lease all the hangars except for Hangar 4, where the All West Boat Company is located. Thus ended an unsettled year for the 35 Saunders employees back in Montreal. Some employees have decided to move to Gimli, and some quit Saunders Aircraft. A meeting was held on January 25, 1971, at the Saunders Montreal hangar with representatives from DOT, ATEL, and Saunders Aircraft. Attending for DOT were Owen, Hamill, Pope, Bohe, Baird, Baker, Gallinger, Archibald, Pilche, Rodriguez, Fione. From Saunders and ATEL, it was Rice and Grant, and Kersey and Jackson. Dave Saunders did not attend this meeting with DOT. Mr. K.D. Owen of DOT stated the objective of the meeting was to familiarize DOT personnel with the ST-27 program prior to the FAA FAR 23 certification program. A discussion was held on the Canadian validation of the British Civil Air Regulation Type Certificate. DOT stated that it recognized its responsibility to advise ARB of the build standard for each aircraft at the time Saunders may elect. It was agreed that if the build standard was declared wrong, it was Saunders and the ARB's problem. Late in January, Gimli Airport would have a famous visitor. Actor Darren McGavin was in town to scout the airport as a possible location for a major film titled Count a Lonely Cadence that McGavin was working on. McGavin was well known to TV viewers from his role in the TV series called Riverboat, starring Darren McGavin and Burt Reynolds. McGavin's proposed movie did not materialize. DOT and the ARB entered discussions on who would be responsible for the condition of the used Herons that would be converted to ST-27s. The following procedure was approved. Heron aircraft with a known history that have been on the UK register or in the RAF would be acceptable for conversion. Heron aircraft with an unknown history or from countries not recognized by the DOT or ARB would have to have a conformity and condition inspection done by either ARB or DOT. A meeting on February 11, 1971 was held at DOT headquarters in Ottawa to finalize the items for the ST-27 Canadian DOT Type Certificate. Attending the meeting were K.D. Owen and R.G. Gallinger from DOT, Rich Kersey from Saunders Aircraft, and Gordon Grout from ATEL. Among the items listed for the forthcoming evacuation demonstration of the ST-27 to FAR 23 certification regulations. A series of DOT flight tests were also scheduled. As 1971 moved towards spring, the move to Gimli continued, and a big change in Saunders Aircraft was ahead.
This was a KPK Air 18 video production. Thank you for watching.